this installment in the Discover Auburn lecture series that's jointly sponsored by the libraries and the Caroline Marshall Drawn Center for the Arts and Humanities in the College of Liberal Arts and the AU Bookstore. There are copies of Letters from Alabama on sale, by the way, in the room behind the reference desk. As I understand it, there are only 8 or maybe less now available, but if you're interested in that, you can pick one up, and there will be a reception in that room following the lecture with refreshments. I don't see Dean Guthrie here. Is Richard, if you're here, stand up. I guess I was going to ask Dean Guthrie to introduce our speaker, and I guess he was held up with other issues. So I'm Dwayne Cox. I'm head of special collections, and I will introduce Dr. Mullen, who, if you don't know Dr. Mullen, he's somebody that you need to get to know. He is a delightful person. It's been my privilege to know him for a long time. I remember well his farewell address as the head of the University Senate. As I recall, he dealt with a few controversial issues during his tenure there. But I best know Gary because he, although he's an entomologist, and he can answer all kinds of interesting questions about entomology, he can tell you the most humane way to kill Japanese beetles. I'll let you ask him about that, but I best know Dr. Mullen because of his interest in the history of his discipline, and particularly in the life of P.H. Goss, who was a British naturalist who visited Alabama in 1838, and whose life Dr. Mullen has been researching for some years now. Several years ago, through his help, the library was able to acquire color copies of Goss's drawings that he did of Alabama insects when he spent several months in Dallas County. The originals of those belong to the British Museum. Don't suggest that we get them to give them to us. We've tried that and they won't do it. But we're delighted to have the copies, and I think the museum, Auburn's Art Museum, has done some things to publicize those as well that Dr. Mullen can tell you more about. But without further ado, Gary Mullen.
Got to turn myself on. Okay, thank you, Dwayne. I appreciate those introductory remarks. I just want to say from the outset that I'm really pleased with this Discover Auburn series.
David Martin, who always is a gadfly, I want to apologize for the spelling of naturalist there. Oh, you did that.
That's me.
I thought I
That's
did.
me. Thank you for drawing attention to it. And this is being video recorded. Thank you. Thank you. So I do take responsibility for that and all that follows. Where was I? I was just going to comment. I really appreciate this Discover Auburn series, and I'm certainly pleased to be invited to participate, to give an opportunity for some of the faculty to talk about some of their interests and some of the areas in which they have been working. And as Dwayne has indicated, Philip Henry Goss is an interest of mine. And I've got a lot to say, so I'm going to kind of move right along, but start out by at least giving you an idea who Philip Henry Goss is. Now, this is a later picture in life. This is at the prime of his life. He's in his late 40s, almost 50 at this time, and already is a very accomplished, well, I don't mean already, but by that age, was a very accomplished naturalist zoologist in Europe. He was already elected as a fellow to the Royal Society in London, despite having very little formal background He had already written what was to go on to become a total of 44 books, not to mention 300 other articles and so forth that were published. He's credited with inventing or coming up with the formula for artificial seawater, first one to establish a marine aquarium, designed the first public aquarium, which was a marine aquarium in London in 1858, etc., etc., etc. Well, it's interesting that we find out this accomplished individual did have Alabama connections and had been here in Alabama for less than 8 months back in 1838, and that's what I want to focus on. So I'm not going to take a lot of time to go into his background and history and so forth, except to say he arrived at Mobile in 1838 on a schooner from Philadelphia, and this is a painting, a portrait that was done of him within a year after that, so give you some idea in his younger years what he looked like. A young 28-year-old self-taught naturalist, excuse me, a self-taught naturalist that found himself at the entrance to Mobile Bay and shortly thereafter on his way up the Alabama River to Dallas County, with his destination being a community excuse me, called Pleasant Hill. We'll come back and talk about that briefly in a moment. But I want to comment on, and I'm going to try to draw from his own writings with certain quotes and passages to give you sort of a flavor for his own words without using too much of that, but throughout these remarks. He produced a book called, as some of you have seen and some of you at least have heard, this little book, 306 pages, called Letters from Alabama. And this was published in 1859, so appreciate this is some years after he was here. And in this, he gives a first-hand account, quite a number of aspects, but with a focus on natural history and particularly entomology. And in his preface, he says, the following pages contain records of impressions made upon my mind during a residence of 7 or 8 months in the hilly region of the state of Alabama. It is part of the United States visited by comparatively few Europeans, and those who have ever seen it have almost exclusively confined their acquaintance with it to the brief glances obtained from the interior of a stagecoach or the deck of a river steamboat. And he's absolutely right. By that time, there was very little recorded details about the area. This was the interior just being opened up with the plantation and Black Belt area, the cotton growing, steamboats plying the Alabama River now, providing access, but otherwise a pretty remote area and really more of a frontier area in many respects. But anyway, that's his, he's a little bit apprehensive as to just what lay ahead. But in short, he'd come south looking for employment. He was also interested in collecting exotic insects and thought this would be a great place to do it, but he was going to make his living as a school teacher, basically a schoolmaster at a small log schoolhouse near present-day Pleasant Hill in Dallas County. So let's take a look then as to his arrival then at Mobile Bay. He's going to make his way up the Alabama River, and he leaves in the evening and will actually be on board through that night all the next day, and it won't be until early, just before dawn, about an hour before dawn the following day, that he will arrive at his destination in Dallas County. Now, just to help orient us, this is where we're talking about then present-day Dallas County. He describes while he's aboard that steamer how winding the Alabama River is, and he says, quote, perhaps no river so winding as the Alabama, and he was quite fascinated by that. 120 miles as the crow flies to get to where he was headed, King's Landing, but it was a lot longer there by boat with all the winding and bends of the river, and hearing steamboats and their horns coming from one direction, and then they'd be behind you, and then it'd be hours later before it passed you, etc., but was impressed with the Alabama River from the outset. Well, as he's making his trip up the Alabama River, he just describes what he sees there. He first starts out down near Mobile with the flat, marshy country, and he says that many miles through a flat, marshy country that was bordered on each side by a broad belt of reeds, and that was his first real glimpse of at least of the natural history. What impressed him were awesome numbers, what he called myriads of fireflies. This was in the evening now, appreciate that he had just left Mobile, and he was quite impressed, and he said they made their interrupted lines of radiance as they flew like shooting stars through the air. And he has a way with words, and I think that interrupted line of radiance, he has a way of capturing that for those who've seen butterflies. fireflies in flight at night. He also commented on how calm the river was and its mirror-like surface, quote, unruffled by a zephyr, and it gives back the light of each individual star. Well, he was so intrigued with the evening and how pleasant this was as his first introduction. He's feeling a little bit more, I think, comfortable. But he was quite struck with how quiet it was along the wooded shorelines. Eventually, they did see agricultural clearings and so forth, but for the most part, they were just wood yards. Wood yards would have been clearing of woods, trees that were cut down as fuel for the steamboats. But other than that, he didn't see too much human habitation, but these beacon fires, as he called them, from the wood yards caught his attention, and he mentions along the way that, quote, while the hoarse and hollow booming of the steam occurring at regular measured intervals. He ended up staying up virtually most of the night while all the rest of the passengers retired, stayed on deck, and just was quite impressed. He's up sunrise the next morning, and he goes on to describe this as the eastern sky began to glow and brighten into a fiery red. Soon the sun, with dilated face, peeped over the horizon in cloudless majesty, and flushed with golden light the hills and cultivated fields that surrounded us. But he was quite taken by the river itself and how the reflections, beautiful reflections from the sky and the water and so forth. And soon, by that next following day, manages to arrive at King's Landing. Now, King's Landing was a major steamboat landing. Virtually all the steamers on the Alabama going up to Selma and Montgomery, they would make a stop there along with several other places en route. Just to give you kind of orientation, Cahaba, spelt then with a W, but Cahaba was no longer the capital. The capital had already moved to Tuscaloosa at this time, and you can see Selma. But those were the only towns of any consequence within the area that he was going to be spending his time. Now this is zooming in a bit closer up, and I don't know how well you can see it back there, but by way of orientation, I don't know if you can see that cursor or not. This is the Alabama River. This is Cahaba, Alabama's first formal capital. And right here is King's Landing, right on this bend in the Alabama River. What he's going to do then is make a trek, a 10-mile walk from King's Landing. Whoa. Now, I don't know if I can back up. Let's see. Good. He's going to make a walk. The roads don't exist anymore, but it goes across here, crosses Mush Creek, and he's going to come on down to the residence of Chief Justice Reuben Saffold's plantation, located here. So this distance is about 5 or 6 miles, and then it's about another 4.5 miles to Pleasant Hill, and that's the nearest community name that we associate and what he refers to because he visited that location quite regularly. So I just want to show you, make a few comments about his trek there across that 10-mile stretch. He said it was very leisurely. He was in no hurry. He says, I was not disposed to hurry on my journey, especially as so many charming things were every instant catching my attention. And he ended up, as he notes, walking about 1 mile an hour. He went about 10 miles. It took him 10 hours, took him all day, and he was just absolutely charmed as his choice of words of what he saw. He saw fox squirrels that really impressed him. He saw summer tanagers and scarlet tanagers, a whole array of butterflies, beautiful flowers, growing along the road's edge and so forth. And when he comes to Mush Creek, it was just a fordable creek, and much of the year you could ford it, but at that time the water was still fairly high. The bridge there actually was a tree that had been cut down, and so after watching what he describes as a 4-foot snake basking on the log, after it left, he proceeded to make his way across that. From his description, it's a racer of some type, and I don't know just which species. He called it a copper belly, but noted that it was not dangerous, but he was still impressed with what he saw. So he continues on and follows a road. Well, if you go to Dallas County and you search the area well, you'll find that the old roadbed still exists, and this is a part of that. Actually, it's just this side, the east side of Mush Creek, and no doubt the actual path that he followed. It was a horse path and a wagon path that hauled supplies to and from Pleasant Hill to the landing on the river. Well, he ends up getting to the community of Pleasant Hill. Unfortunately, has left us this engraving to give us some idea what that might have looked like. And most of these images that I'm going to show you, and the engravings in particular, are included in Letters from Alabama. There are other things that we'd like to have had him sketch that he didn't, but very fortunate for the ones he provided. So virtually all the images I'm going to show you are ones that he actually produced himself. So we see this wagon loaded with cotton coming into town. It was only about 5 structures, just wooden structures. It was a post office, a mercantile store, just a location where you could come to pick up supplies. A stagecoach would stop there, etc. He did not live here. He lived as a boarder at one of the plantations called the Bohannon Place, and it's about 2 miles from Pleasant Hill. And that's where he will be spending his time during most of these 8 months. Well, while there, he did teach at the schoolhouse, and I'm not going to take time to say too much about that except to describe the setting so as to lead into a little bit more about the natural history of the area as he described it. Now, keep in mind that he spent most of his time while I was here between this plantation where he boarded and then virtually all day, except on the weekends, at the schoolhouse. So most of his descriptions that he provides are on those treks, the 2 miles to the schoolhouse in the morning, which he really enjoyed, the cooler time of the day, because it was hot much of the time he was here. I didn't mention, but except that he was not here a long time, I just appreciate it. He comes in May, but he will have left and have been on board a ship back to England by the end of the year, by the end of December. So he really was here much of the time during the summer and then into the fall. But he describes the surrounding area and particularly the forests. And just his description then of the location then of the school, the situation of the school is singularly romantic. A space of about 100 yards square has been cleared in the forest, with the exception of 2 or 3 lofty oaks which are left for shade, and on every side are shut in by a dense wall of towering forest trees rising to the height of 100 feet. Oaks, hickories, and pines of different species extend for miles on every hand. He was obviously enthralled with these forests. And I appreciate coming from England. This is not something he'd had the opportunity to see very much of. And so he makes lots of comparisons or comments of what he had seen elsewhere. But just since he, I think, was just struggling for words to try to capture the kind of emotional sense of these pristine forests. He says, there is an inexpressible grandeur in these primeval forests. And many of the trees are immense magnitude, and their trunks rise like pillars from the soft and damp soil, shooting upwards in columnal majesty. Not in general, gnarled and twisted and branched like the trees of our own land, as even these same kinds would be if growing in the open field. But he was really impressed with the awesome height of these trees and just the vast expanses. And he goes on to say that, and thus we see the original forest. So he refers to this primeval or original forests. And he goes on to comment about how these are well shaded, very little understory, and makes the comment about the hunters pursuing their game on horseback at full speed through these sylvan recesses, just making the point of how widely spaced and open these dark forests are beneath that dense canopy of 100 feet or more in height. And then he tries to capture again sort of the essence. It's almost spiritual overtones. You'd have to know Goss and his life and his sensibilities as to why this struck him as such. But he talks about to walk in the forest alone is a high gratification. He really wasn't a real mixer. He enjoyed being by himself. He enjoyed quietude, solemnity, and so forth. And he goes on to say that the perfect stillness and the utter solitude, unbroken, commonly by even ordinary woodland sounds and sights, tranquilizes and sobers the mind. And he relished that. And then he says the gloom has a solemn effect, but it's not gloom in a negative sense. It's gloom in the sense of dark and quiet and still and almost reverential. And he, I think, expresses this in other places in his writings as well. So it says, for there is no light but what penetrates to the green leaves far above our head, and the range of vision all around us is limited by the innumerable straight and smooth trunks, exactly alike on every side, in which the fancy becomes lost. He goes on to say the devout spirit is drawn upward in such a scene with imagination presently turning into a magnificent temple, whose far distant roof is borne on uncounted columns, and indeed it is a glorious temple, one worthy of the hand that reared it. And he sees a lot in terms of everything he looks at. It's almost a reverence for nature. And this is another part of his life and story, but appreciate that he is awed by what he sees. And it doesn't matter what it is. It really impresses him as beauty and perfection. And as we'll see, he tries to capture that in his artistic work to try to share an appreciation, especially for insects, which I'm quite pleased to comment on, and we'll get back to that a little bit later. But very quickly, he comments on a number of individual trees and what he thinks about those. He talks about the American chestnut as being one of the more common trees, and it's at the same time one of the most noble of our forest trees. And he talks about the American chestnut, how not only common, but again, 100 feet or more in height. He comments on the sycamore, and he also calls it a noble tree. And I think this is where he starts to run out of words to try to capture, but it's just the overtone. Lots of things are noble, and the trees certainly qualify. But he says it's probably the most notable, probably the most noble tree of our forests. And he says he was told about a sycamore that wasn't too far away, and he said this thing was huge. But as with a lot of the old sycamores, part of dying, the central part left a big hollow, and he had been told, and he believed that, even though he didn't actually get a chance to visit this tree, that a man could stand there with a rail on his shoulder and can turn around in the hollow of that sycamore. Well, those rails, as he points out, are often 10 to 14 feet in length. But he didn't doubt that at all, given the size of the sycamore trees, a little bit different perspective than what we, of course, see when we look at sycamore trees today. He also mentions the tulip tree. He particularly admired these, what he called far-famed trees, especially noted for their flowers. And the tree itself, he says, is one of the most magnificent in our forest, and often attaining the height of 120 feet. And assuming that his estimations are fairly correct, again, a lot of very large, impressive trees. And he considered that second only to the, what he called giant sycamores in terms of the height of these trees. And he goes on to describe magnolias as the queen of the forests, comments about sassafras being exceedingly common, etc. Well, we could spend more time talking about the forest, but these are sort of his first impressions, the first days that he is here, and he is really awed. Well, he goes on to, and again, these are all engravings that he produced subsequent to his, he did these as sketches, in some cases watercolors, took them back with him to England, and then when he had the opportunity later, when he pulled this information together in the form of this book that was published, as I mentioned, 1859, then these are engravings that accompany this, what he described here as the turtle dove, making the woods resound with their soft and mournful notes. And he says that there being something inexpressibly touching in it, soothing our spirits and calming into unison with the peaceful quiet of nature. Well, in the lower part of the figure, he has what he's calling a cardinal grosbeak, but you'll recognize as the northern cardinal. He's quite intrigued with the hummingbirds and the ruby throat in particular, and enjoys watching these sipping nectar from the flowers growing around the schoolhouse as well as around the plantation homes and so forth. And he describes them in their brilliant plumage, gleaming in the sun like gold and precious stones. Well, he also was quite taken the first time he heard what he called the Chuck Will's widow calling. It was in the evening, very warm, and so the windows were always left open. They didn't have screens, they didn't have glass, etc., but they did have lattice just to keep out the bats at night and the birds during the daytime, but certainly allowed him to hear the night sounds. He was kept awake by katydids, and he thought that's one thing I think he wanted to turn off. The katydids were loud. He said you couldn't sleep at night. But he was quite impressed when he heard this particular bird a stone's throw, as he says, from his window, where he was sitting, and he notes its singular nature as far as its particular call and how he delighted with its sound. He also, on another occasion, was out in a cypress swamp at night, purposely. It wasn't that he got lost, but he went out just to see the nightlife and would be accompanied by some of the local folks, either hunting or otherwise. And the first time he encountered what he called the eagle owl, you'll recognize that as the great horned owl, but instead he was startled by its voice that sounded like a challenge of a sentinel. I guess the Who might suggest that, but arresting our intruding footsteps. And then he was quite struck when this bird flew down, and of course the silent flight of the owl, and came very close, says, sweeping noiselessly by before our faces. And he describes this as a noble bird with feathery ears and large, staring, yellow, moony eyes. Well, he goes on to describe the nighthawk, and for those of you familiar with the nighthawk, it's another interesting bird of the evening. And I do want to read you this quote because I think this kind of represents, and I won't overdo it by giving you more and more and more quotations, but again, his sense of not just describing something as a scientist. There was always that overtone of a spiritual nature to it. And it also provides some insight as to some behavior and some of the local lore as well. But he says, notice those birds resembling swallows, which are mounting on the wing higher and higher and higher, screaming as they descend, till, having gained a great elevation, down each plunges with closed wings like a stone, so that you think he will be killed by the fall. But just before he reaches the earth, he suddenly wheels around and again mounts on the wing. The most singular part of the procedure is that at the moment the bird arrests its precipitate descent, a hollow boom is heard, something like a heavy gun at a great distance, or the hoarse bellowing of a bull. The common people here generally call these birds by the name bull bats. Now, scattered throughout his writings, you will pick up some of these colloquialisms and some terms that you may or may not be familiar with. Or you may have heard of a bull bat. Maybe you had no idea what a bull bat is, but they're interwoven with his accounts that provide at least some local color and some of the, as I say, colloquialisms of the day. Well, moving along, I know for those of you who were here for the recent Discover Auburn lecture on the ivory-billed woodpecker, well, they were very abundant. The locals called them logcocks, L-O-G-C-O-C-K-S. It didn't make a distinction. That common name applied to the pileated and the ivory-billed woodpeckers. But he was quite struck by these birds as well, and makes quite an extensive comment on them. He said that the pileated is by far the more common, but he was taken by hearing their loud, talking about both of them actually, their loud cachinnations as I wend my way to and from the school. So he was quite particularly struck by the ivory-billed, and not to elaborate too much, but he says, after looking at one, or a pair actually, were sitting on a perpendicular trunk in full view, digging away with great force and effect, I thought this a very magnificent bird. And then he goes on to say, we succeeded in shooting both, which I skinned and dissected. Okay, well, but they were so abundant. In fact, there was so much noise by these large woodpeckers that they could sometimes just be a nuisance or annoying even in the daytime. Things have changed a little bit. Well, he makes a brief comment about the gold-winged woodpecker that you would recognize perhaps more commonly as the yellow hammer, the Alabama state bird. He called that a fine bird as well. And one of the boys got a ladder one day and they climbed up a tree. Of course, the kids were great because at school or just in the community, they would come and tell him tales or things that are of interest, and he was really impressed with how knowledgeable the kids were about nature and distinguishing different species and where to find things and so forth. So they led him to a lot of the things that he provided accounts for. And in this particular case, he'd heard about the nest of this gold-winged woodpecker, and so they got a ladder, climbed up, and the youngster pulled out one of these young birds for him to look at, and he said it was not pretty. Young birds never are. And one other comment about birds before we leave them, the Carolina parakeet was still around, but already had substantially been reduced in numbers. And he only got to see the Carolina parakeet on one occasion, and this was when he made a trip to Selma and riding on horseback one day. And he said, I had the pleasure of seeing a flock of what he called parrots. The bird is not all common in these parts, and indeed it was the first occasion in which I'd ever seen one of this beautiful tribe in a state of wild nature. And he goes on to comment there were about 80 to 100 in a compact flock that swept by, screaming as they went. He said, I fancied that they looked like an immense shawl of green satin on which an irregular pattern was worked in scarlet and gold and azure, and the sun's rays were brilliantly reflected from the gorgeous surface which rapidly sped past like a splendid vision. Well, a lot of other birds and so forth that he talks about as well, but he didn't overlook the squirrels. We already mentioned that he's seen the fox squirrel while he was making that trek from King's Landing over to the Saffold place, and where he was to subsequently take up residence. He called this a pretty little animal. I think he was quite sympathetic. He did not like to see animals killed, but he recognized that, yeah, they made good food, so he kind of accepted that. But he said they're amusing to watch, especially their maneuverings as they dart up and down the tree trunks and in and out of the hollows. But he says all this pretty play, all this is pretty play, but the merciless planter puts a tragical end to it with his unerring rifle. Of course, that means dinner. The flesh of squirrel was good, and he still had a little trouble taking these beautiful animals that he had just gotten to see for the first time, and without any sense of remorse whatsoever, they were shot for the dinner plate. Well, I don't know that he was quite as enamored with the opossum, although he nicely illustrates it as well, describes a possum hunt, was impressed with the prehensile tail, appreciating these just don't occur in England. He talks about the shamming or playing dead, and in general, just kind of objectively comments descriptively about the possum, but doesn't seem to at least place it quite up there with many of the magnificent birds and the fox, squirrels, and so forth. Well, he also describes things like the raccoons and bear, and brief mention of beaver and so forth. But moving along, he visited a number of swamps, cypress swamps, some just bottomland areas that were quite swampy, and I'm not going to go into much detail there, but again, providing a very vivid description of what these looked like. This is one of the few kind of habitat shots that he provides, and you see the trees overhanging the water and draping with the Spanish moss, and the turtle, which is resting on this log. He talks about how the locals trap turtles, various devices they used, and using what he calls just strong hooks that were baited with a piece of flesh, and that sometimes they shot the larger turtles. But again, that's because, quote, the flesh is good to eat. And the one that impressed him the most was the snapping turtle. He'd never seen anything like a snapping turtle, either in size or their rather ferocious behavior at times if you provoked them. But he says that, unwary persons having their fingers amputated at a single snap of this vicious creature. But appreciating he's seeing all these things for the first time, although he's been very widely read, so he's heard about these things, but it just was not the same as seeing it for yourself. Well, he talks about some of the skinks and the lizards, the anole, rattlesnake being quite common, although he didn't seem too concerned about it. He never mentions having any encounters, never mentions the water moccasin, despite all his tromping around, but he kind of casually mentions the rattlesnakes and how they would smoke them out of the holes to get rattlesnakes, but didn't spend a lot of time with them, but at least makes comments about some of the reptiles and amphibians, including some of the toads and other things as well. But I do want to mention one other group that he was particularly also struck with, not in a favorable sense, but ticks. In fact, he goes on to spend 3 full pages talking about ticks. The very first day he's at the schoolhouse, he ends up getting a tick attached to his chest. He'd never encountered ticks before. And he talked about a violent twinge in my breast. Well, I mean, most ticks, I think, attach quite quietly, but this one apparently got his attention. He said it stung like a wasp. And then I examined beneath his clothes and discovered what he calls these rascally ticks. And then he's struggling for words to try to characterize these creatures. And he says that scarcely a day elapses without other polite attentions of the same kind. But I am informed that this is nothing to what I may expect in a month or two when the seed ticks come out. Now, he doesn't come back and comment about the seed ticks, but he makes a few comments then. But ticks, and especially the nuisance of mosquitoes, and a lot of other biting flies and so forth, they certainly were very common in that area, and they did not escape his attention. He was really sympathetic to the horses, the cattle, the dogs, and as well as the humans, just for the enormous nuisance that these ticks provided, and says it is pitiable to see the poor brutes. And they are among the most, talking about the ticks now, they are among the most disagreeable pests of the country. I dislike them even more than the mosquitoes. Well, I do want to move along so that we can comment on one other habitat, which is the prairie. This is a picture, I don't know how well you can make that out. This is a picture that was taken back in the late 1920s by Peter Brannan. For those of you who know Brannan as an Alabama historian and for many, many years as a state archivist in Montgomery, he took a keen interest in Philip Henry Goss. And this is one of the pictures he took, trying to visit some of the places where Goss had been. This is what the prairie, which was a beautiful, undisturbed area in this particular location, looked like in 1920. Nothing like a prairie. And that's one of the things in this Black Belt area, scattered prairie sites that have been virtually eliminated by agriculture, and the habitat destruction has wiped out, probably in addition to the forest, the area that struck Goss with the most, I think, awe, the prairie, because of its diversity of wildflowers and especially the diversity of insects, which was a major preoccupation of his. But this is looking from a site called that he calls Prairie Knoll. And in describing this, he talks about the prairies in the area, saying that there are in this neighborhood many prairies, not the boundless prairies of the West, but little ones, varying in extent from an acre to a square mile. But this was one that was fairly close, not too far from the Bohannon place where he was staying, and he visited regularly to collect. He says, generally, they're so well defined that one can hardly be persuaded that these prairies are not just clearings made with the axe of a settler. Small patches. This was one of the larger ones, but had a nice panoramic view because of the hilly nature. It was up on a knoll, and he says that had an impressive view of the surrounding landscape and the unbroken forests. So he went there quite regularly, as I say, to collect, one of his favorite places, and was really impressed, especially in, of course, he didn't get here till May, so that late spring and very, very early summer before the wildflowers faded, and the collecting wasn't quite so good, but he was really struck by the diversity of insects. And he said that I frequently come to spend an hour here entomologizing. We don't use that word very often, but you get it. Entomologizing, and never fail to be well rewarded for it. So he goes on to describe the what he calls open prairies and wooded prairies, which I'm not going to get into. Let me show you just another picture. This is also one taken from the Prairie Knoll, also by Peter Brannan, looking down this hill. Well, there's no hint of a prairie at this time, and certainly no hint of these vast surrounding forests that he originally described. And there's just a close-up of that same one. Well, as I say, this is where he did a lot of his insect collecting, and that's what I want to focus in the few remaining minutes that I have. You'll notice this is an engraving that he has done. You'll see his initials down here in the lower left of a dung beetle. People often ask of these insects that he has illustrated or written about or painted with his watercolors and so forth, how are there extinct species? Are there species we just don't see anymore? And the answer generally is probably not. I'm not aware of any of these that I'll talk about or show you as you look at his other paintings that have become, quote, extinct. They may have been eliminated from Dallas County because of the elimination of the habitat, but it's not like the species are no longer with us, but their numbers are dramatically reduced. Back then, these dung beetles and rolling a ball of cow dung would have been extremely common. And now you're hard-pressed in pastures and other areas to find them. But he did a beautiful job of these engravings that he did. Here's one of the, we'll just call it a large beetle without getting too technical, but to give you some idea, the technique that a very accomplished engraver, but an even more accomplished artist when it comes to the use of watercolors. He was particularly enamored with the butterflies, and these earlier engravings were efforts to try to capture them as well, and served as illustrations for his books. Well, in looking into Goss's life, and it was really by reading his son's biography of his father, that is, the biography of Philip Henry Goss, that there is reference made that while he was here in Alabama, that he did these paintings, a collection of watercolors that had never been published. And it's a long story, but to make it short with a little sleuthing, was able to discover back in the late 80s that these actually did exist and were in the possession of his great-granddaughter, Jennifer Goss, great-granddaughter of Philip Henry Goss, now residing in England. This is a picture that I took just a year ago, March, when I visited her, appreciating my first visit about 15 years ago. She looked a little younger than this, but the point is, this is Jennifer Goss, and we're greatly indebted to her for keeping these, appreciating they've been passed down generation to generation, and particularly through her father, who made a concerted effort to try to preserve these things so that she had them in her personal possession in her home. And I'm going to give you a chance to see, you can see some examples. These are great enlargements, but I'll comment on that in just a moment. When I say great enlargements, they're greatly enlarged. The originals don't look like that at all. In fact, let me just go back to this. No, I can go on to the next one. This is a sketchbook, and all of the 48 paintings that he does of Alabama insects in watercolor are all contained in this one sketchbook. This is a bound sketchbook. This isn't a collection of paintings that were subsequently bound. And as you turn one page to the next, you don't see any errors, sketches, and so forth. It is quite extraordinary, not only the quality, but the fact that he did these by conceptualizing the whole watercolor before he ever started in composition on the page and so forth, and then produced these. How large are these? Well, if you look at that page is 6 1/4 inches wide, 7 1/2 inches high. This is already greatly magnified on the screen. He painted in miniature, and the detail is nothing short of extraordinary. Now, I'm not going to take the time to blow these up. Let me just say, you can enlarge these as large as you want on a screen. You can reproduce them and enlarge them. I've looked at them under a microscope. You can enlarge them as much as you want, and all you do is see more detail. It is nothing short of phenomenal, the technique. So how does this self-taught, basically not at least formally educated individual produce these works? Well, he's indebted to his father. Thomas Goss was a miniature portrait painter. And if you're familiar with miniature portraits, especially back in 16th, 17th, 18th century without cameras and so forth, yes, the only way you're going to get a likeness of your family members and so forth was to at least hire an artist, and they produced these in miniature. Often they're just about like 3 inches tall. Often you'll see them in oval frames and so on. But his father was a miniature portrait painter, and it's from his father as a youngster that he and his brother William learned at least the basics of miniature painting. He was not interested in doing portraits. He was not interested in making a living at painting. He never considered himself an artist. This was simply a tool, just as his writing was, to try to capture that splendor of nature in all its glory, all its perfection and so forth, and share that with the common folk. He wasn't writing for the scientist. He was writing for the average person, to have them appreciate the beauty of nature. And the more closely he looked, and he used insects as an example, made his own little pocket microscope, and that's how he could produce so much detail, right down to the finest details of individual hairs, and I won't say scales, but even your images of butterflies look like they're scaled and so on. Really quite extraordinary. He was very good at rendering the plants, but the plants were really just a backdrop for the insects. But he did it not as an artist, or that was not his motivation. It was to show other people, look and not only enjoy, but revel in the splendor of nature as he saw it. So keep that in mind. All of these images, these enlargements here, are reproductions, and the original is 6 1/2 by 7 1/2 inches. Well, Dwayne Cox mentioned that the library was able, back in, he didn't say, but it was 1993, to purchase a complete set of color positive transparencies. These are 4 by 5 color transparencies, but positive transparencies. These were reproduced directly, and it's the only set that I know in existence. These have not been reproduced. None of them have been published except for a few with special permission. But we were fortunate, even though efforts were, once we discovered these, thought they would be a great addition to special collections here with the Alabama connections and so on. But Jennifer Goss was a little reticent about parting. She just couldn't see them leaving English soil. And so, as I tell folks, she did the next best thing, and she did deposit them on loan in the manuscripts collection at the British Library. And subsequently, that has become a permanent gift to the British Library. And if you want to see the originals, you've got to go to London to do so. But this is an example from which these images that you've seen produced and the ones that I will show you have been reproduced. Just very quickly, just to show you a sampling. This is a mole cricket in the upper left, and then, which many of you will recognize, is this very showy black with the red wings, the lubber grasshopper. It's kind of hard with the lighting to appreciate that, but if you look at the original, you can see the luster, you can see the sheen. The colors are incredibly faithfully reproduced, very accurately, and have held up beautifully. One of the more impressive plates, and that's also illustrated here, they don't do justice, again, to seeing the original. There's just something about seeing the originals themselves, but to give you some idea of his illustrations. And he has one plate, really, of beetles in color. What his fascination was really with the butterflies and sort of secondarily the moths. He reared a lot of these, that is, held them on host plants, recorded what they fed on, followed their development, illustrated the larval stage, and here we see the pupae of several moths. It wasn't that he was studying them in their, in their own right. What he was really doing is trying to get the pristine adult, because that's all he felt that he could illustrate. He wanted the perfect specimen. If you're going to capture the perfection of creation, you had to have the perfect specimen, so you don't get some battered up old specimen that you caught in your insect net. So he reared these for that express purpose. And then his most striking by far, and certainly by number, are his illustrations, these watercolors of butterflies, particularly prairie species and so forth from Dallas County. And here we see the zebra swallowtail on the left and the spicebush swallowtail on the right. And that's purple coneflower, one of the more characteristic prairie flowers. He was impressed with the moths, and especially with the hawk moths or sphingid moths, for those that are familiar. And he would use, again, common plants that they would visit. In this particular case, he uses red morning glory as the backdrop. And what is Alabama's state butterfly, in case you weren't aware of it, the monarch that most people will recognize. And again, if you look at the color, you look in it, you can enlarge them as much as you want. These colors are so faithful. It is unbelievable how he has managed to capture all of these ranges of colors and tones and so forth, and these have held up beautifully. One of the reasons these have been preserved so well is that they were in that sketchbook. So it was kept closed. It wasn't exposed to the light. So it had been kept in a trunk, or it would be kept in a desk, or somewhere tucked away all these years. So it's held up remarkably well. In fact, watercolor holds up a lot better than oil and doesn't discolor, and so these probably look very, very similar to what they did when they were first produced. And I think this last image that I'll show you of his work, I think is one of the most striking, and at least it personally strikes me. The composition and the detail that he has provided here, and he shows the upper and the lower surface of each specimen so you get to see it in full detail. It's really quite remarkable. Well, we're already pushing, I think, what time we have, so let me just comment. For those of you who are not aware, there is an exhibit of Goss's watercolors of Alabama insects, including some of the ones that I've shown you, at the Jewel Collins Smith Museum of Fine Art here in Auburn. It has been there. It opened in April. Half of his watercolors are on exhibit. That's 24 of the 48 in the gallery there. At the end of this month, they will be changed out, and the other 24 images will be then displayed. But I also want to mention that there is a special opportunity a week from today, that is next Thursday, October 11th, for what's titled 19th Century Naturalism, Philip Henry Goss. And there will be two presentations at the Jewel Collins Smith Museum, one of which I will be given. It will be very different from what we've talked about today, more about his life and earlier life and what brought him here to Alabama, which is an interesting story in its own right, but a closer look at the watercolors, the technique he used, and I think some information you might find of interest. But if you don't get to that lecture, at least, or lectures, I'll comment on the other in a moment, please take the opportunity to stop by the museum, and it will be showing from now through next April. It's just, if you want to see the first half of them, you got to get there by the end of October. Otherwise, you'll just see the second half. The second presentation, as part of these two public lectures, will be by Ann Thwaite. And Ann Thwaite is a biographer. She has written this biography about Goss called Glimpses of the Wonderful, and that's a takeoff on a title that he used for one of his papers, The Life of Philip Henry Goss, an excellent scholarly treatment of Goss's life. She will be given the second presentation. She is not a biologist, she's not a scientist, and she certainly doesn't claim to be an entomologist, but she is a biographer of quite renown herself, and she will be giving a perspective of Philip Henry Goss as a biographer. And this complements, because much of, I think, with a weaker part of the book is his early life, certainly his Alabama years and so forth, which has been my particular interest. But we're pleased to have her. We'll be hosting her next week in Auburn. She'll be arriving on Tuesday and be staying through the week, and there'll be hopefully opportunities for you to meet her. There will be a reception next Thursday following the two public lectures at the museum, and be an opportunity for you to meet her there. Well, let me stop there and just say I appreciate once again this opportunity to say a little bit about Philip Henry Goss, recognizing he's not a household name, but trying to correct that at least to some extent and appreciate his connections then with Dallas County and Alabama. Thank you. Now, Dwayne, I'm going to consider your emceeing this. Can we take questions, or how are we doing time-wise? What?
Has humankind been harder on the Ivorybilled woodpeckers than on some of the insects?
Well, I think quite definitely. They're a lot more vulnerable. You've got to give insects credit, whether you like them or not. They are extraordinary creatures, and they are survivors. And so it's very difficult to eliminate them. You may set them back, and many of them have been. It's just like those beautiful butterflies that were so common, as well as some of the, just like the American chestnut. I mean, some things were common, and you can explain why they disappeared, but the insects are survivors, and they manage to hang on in these little refuges in small numbers, or they may no longer be in Dallas County, but they may be over in western Alabama counties and so forth. So when we talk about extinction, yeah, we can talk about local extinction. There's no question. Most of those prairie species are very difficult to find today in Dallas County. On the other hand, there are remnants. They are small, and fortunately, a number of them are being protected, but there are small remnants of prairie where these are still hanging on. We just don't see the numbers. And of course, there's no one out there documenting, monitoring, and so forth, individual species. So, you know, it's not always easy to tell how common they are even today just because people don't see them regularly. Carolyn?
Gary, you have the 48 watercolors, but then are there sketches or other things from Alabama from which those engravings were made? Are they in the British Museum, or what's happened with that?
That's a good question. One of the things I've been interested in is, where did these engravings go, or were there other paintings? I'd love to have seen a watercolor or an engraving of the log schoolhouse. I can't believe he spent all that time there, and we don't even know for sure where it's located. I could point to you approximately where we think it is, but a log schoolhouse, there's not much to be preserved after 170 years. But as far as the engravings are concerned, I do not know what happened to those after that book was published. Whether he ever got them back or whether they were destroyed, that doesn't mean they don't exist, but I've not been able to find any trace of them. But I can't help but think that there are others that may still be tucked away in family possessions and so forth. There's even his journals, the log that he kept, the scientific observations, as well as his diary. Those have disappeared. We don't know that they've been destroyed, but nobody knows where they are, and there's some suggestion that they may have ended up with a descendant physician, a cousin actually, a distant cousin who went to Australia. And I'm gladly pursuing that, but I need a little more solid lead before we just designate a continent. But if they are in Australia, they're probably in the Adelaide area. There are a number of Goss descendants there. And it's possible that some of these other things have survived, but they're just not archived, or nobody appreciates perhaps their value or interest. You had a question up here. Did you?
Yeah, what is the reason? Years ago, I saw a lot of butterflies in my garden, and I planted a lot of lantana, and now hardly I see any.
Well, there's no question that butterflies in general, their numbers are dramatically down. Of course, drought years don't help, successive years either. But a lot of it is there's just not extensive enough plantings, and it takes more than a scattered garden here of particular flowers or showy flowers to bring them into, you know, one's backyard where you can appreciate them. At the same time, they're still managing in the wild because they're not dependent upon cultivated flowers. But when we don't see them, sometimes we have an undue sense of they're gone. It's just that they're just not common around the urban areas, but they are still surviving elsewhere. But the numbers, because of habitat destruction, and that's true, not just agriculture, urban sprawl, and so forth, you eliminate the habit and their normal host plants and so forth, you dramatically reduce their population. And that's part of the reality, I think, of today's world.
Yeah, and I heard the same from people, from friends in Switzerland.
Well, it is a worldwide phenomenon, believe you. It's not unique in any way to the U.S., but there's nothing worse for any one of these groups than habitat destruction. I know a number of other questions. Let's start over here.
What first prompted the writer to come to Alabama?
What prompted the writer what?
To go to Alabama, like just for research?
Well, in a nutshell, he was looking for a job and he was desperate. He had spent, and I'll make this very brief, I'll go into this in a little more detail in a lecture next week, but he had been gone from England for 11 years. He left when he was 17 years old, spent 8 years up in Newfoundland, spent 3 years after that in Canada, in present-day Quebec, just north of the Vermont border, trying to make a living at farming, a dismal, dismal failure. He thought it was great during the summer, but that first winter kind of dampened his enthusiasm. He finally gave up on farming, sold his farm at a loss, and had heard that they were looking for teachers in the Deep South. And he thought, well, he would try to move south. Collecting would be a whole lot better since he'd collected most of what he could up there. He would come south looking for a job, thought first the Carolinas, had a letter of introduction here in Alabama, and that's really what brought him to Mobile, and he was on his way to this plantation area where he knew that they were looking for school teachers. Dave?
If Goss encountered Alabama fauna previously unclassified by science, did he attempt to do a classification, and if so, how well has his taxonomy held up?
Well, answer the second question, he didn't have to hold up because he did none of it. And the first part is no, he did not consider himself a taxonomist. He never, to my knowledge, described a single species. He does refer several places in letters from Alabama to insects that he thinks may be undescribed species, but he didn't have access to the collections and so forth, and most of his knowledge was just whatever he could glean from books that he was able to purchase and so forth. So no, he never really had an interest in naming things, but just illustrating what was there. But he was very interested in putting names on them, and so you will see when you look at his sketchbook, both his collection of Alabama paintings and another collection of some 40 paintings that he did while he was in Newfoundland, you'll find pencil notations where he would put the name as to what he learned later when he went back to England, went to the British Museum. He very interested with the entomologist there, put names, then he'd strike a line through it and then change the name when some other revision was done. But no, he did not attempt to describe species himself. Yeah.
I was wondering, it appears that he's a contemporary of Charles Darwin. In fact, Darwin was he on the voyage of the Beagle, or just had finished the voyage of the Beagle? Did he ever know Darwin?
Yes, he did. I don't know if they ever personally met, but they did have a regular correspondence. In fact, very respectful of one another, and Goss sent him a number of specimens, especially marine organisms, particularly barnacles and some other marine organisms, and so they did exchange correspondence. The biggest reference to Darwin is that Goss was very fundamentalist in his view, and he never could reconcile evolution with what he saw. And he tried to explain that, and as he did in most things, he decided to put it in writing to present his case. So he wrote a book about it. And that book is called Omphalos, Greek for navel, as in N-A-V-E-L. And that was his explanation of why he thought evolution and Darwin's theory were in error. And unfortunately, that's what many people associate with Philip Henry Goss, is that particular incident. But despite that, and it was published before On the Origin of Species came out, a year or two before that. So there's a whole book if you want to see what he thought about it. But even after that, they still respectfully corresponded, and neither one took umbrance over that, respected each other's position, and that's the way it was. But he was a contemporary of Darwin, contemporary of John James Audubon, and a lot of other early American naturalists, many foreign-born like himself, that give us that glimpse of what was going on here. Ellsworth, you had a question.
Was he aware of Bartram's trail through about the same area?
I've wondered about that because I would have thought that he would have read that. And I don't know, Catherine, if you can comment on that. I've not come across any passing reference whatsoever to Bartram. So, not that I'm aware of. Somebody else had a question? Wayne.
What can you tell us about the paints that he used for his watercolors?
Well, that's one of the early, and I'm not trained in art history, let alone art as an art. So I've been curious myself. And people would suggest, well, he must have been very good at extracting dyes from plants and so forth and so on. But you realize when you look into this that he had commercially available products. Watercolors, painting and so forth was not a new art. His father was himself a painter, trained at the Royal Academy in London. London was full of art supplies in their stores and so forth. He had no trouble getting a sketchbook, etc. And the only clue that I've come across that gives you a direct, because he virtually does not comment about his technique. He just does not mention it, except in a passing comment about his Newfoundland experiences when somebody, it was really his first girlfriend. It didn't last very long, but she took an interest in watercolors. We're not sure if it was watercolors or if it was Philip, but she wanted to borrow some of his pigments. And he was very hesitant because he says that he took a few pieces of his father's, and these were solid blocks. This wasn't liquid. It wasn't, in a tube. It was just solid blocks, or cakes, as they called it. And so he had taken basically crumbs or broken parts from his father's paint kit when he left for Newfoundland. But presumably he was able to get resupplied because while he was in Newfoundland, he was working with a fishing firm of merchants that had a trade between Newfoundland and England. And so there was no problem for him ordering supplies and getting them from London shops, and I suspect that that's where it came from. So the notion that he had to make his own pigment. But what he was very accomplished at, just a few pigments, he became extremely skilled in terms of mixing those to capture virtually any color that he wanted. And he was a master at that. But a lot of that was probably taking the rudiments, and by trial and error and practice and so forth, he became very good at it. But if you're aware, you only need the primary colors, and at least I'm told black. And if you've got cakes of those particular pigments, if you're good, you can blend those or mix those to get the colors that you want. And he certainly was capable of doing that. Way at the back, Dwayne.
Can you summarize briefly his argument against natural selection?
No. The question, yes, if I could briefly summarize his argument against evolution. He took a whole book to try to explain it, and when you talk about circular reasoning, I don't say that in a pejorative sense, but that was the way he viewed it. Everything occurred in circles, and you really have to read it very carefully to get into his mindset as to why this didn't hold true. And I cannot, even after having read it myself and with some effort, it's not something you can summarize very simply. And so I don't say that facetiously, except honestly, it would be hard for me to succinctly in a few words explain why this just didn't work. It just didn't fit with his religious viewpoints, and he presented his case, but somebody copied it, but I don't know if those others were drawn from life or not. But I would challenge anyone to find an earlier illustration of the ivory-billed, and you will see a lot of similarity in those that subsequently followed. Now, maybe they have such a characteristic pose that you just don't have too many options, but I've wondered about that myself. Again, I thank you very much. Appreciate it.